Tensions growing by the day at colleges across the country.
The current operations are pretty blatantly war crimes, a genocide.
Pro-Palestinian protesters turning campuses into campgrounds, demanding an end to the bloodshed in Gaza.
We're realizing that this is a time for using institutional power to help those who can't.
If you want a ceasefire, the hostages need to be released, and they need to be at the forefront of this discussion.
Today, we dive into their demands, the history and impact of protest movements like this, and what it's going to take to stop them.
If history is any indication, protests against war and conflicts, they will continue to grow as long as the war goes on.
This is CBS News Bay Area with Elizabeth Cook.
Thank you so much for joining us today. The protests are expanding across the country and right here in the Bay Area, including SF State and Sonoma State. Over the next half hour, we'll take a look at the demonstrators' demands and if movements like these have been successful in the past. Tents have popped up on college campuses across the U.S., and students are demanding an end to the war in Gaza. Ann Makovic has been following the protests here in the Bay Area for us. Ann?
Yeah, they are still going on. Students say they plan to stay in some of these camps until their demands are met, and for some, that means even into the summer. In San Francisco, the tents started going up just after noon at SF State. Started with a rally today at the plaza in front of the Student Center, and a group calling themselves Faculty for Justice in Palestine says many teachers are participating today as well. Protesters we spoke with say they want their school to end any financial investments in any company that has a part in manufacturing weapons and any program that benefits Israel. They're calling on the university to support their demonstration and avoid getting law enforcement involved.
We're seeing thousands of innocent people being slaughtered at the hands of, really us, our government, the things that we are unconsensually paying for, and we don't want that. We don't like that.
At Sonoma State, tents went up this weekend on the Person lawn. The students want the university to create an official curriculum on Palestinian history. In addition to full disclosure of all of its investments, the school sent out a statement saying that the safety of student, staff, and visitors is their greatest priority. And this encampment at Stanford University has been up since Thursday. This is in White Plaza. Stanford sent out a mass email to its student body informing them that the actions are in violation of university policy, which could lead to suspension or expulsion. And the first Bay Area encampment went up at UC Berkeley last week. They are still out in front of Sproul Hall. Cal releasing a statement saying that they are not planning to involve law enforcement unless it is absolutely necessary because of the university's past experience with nonviolent political protest. Governor Newsom says he is monitoring all of these demonstrations and is working with university trustees to make sure they remain peaceful. Liz.
Ann, thanks so much. Cal Poly Humboldt will close for the rest of the semester amid ongoing protests there. That means through May 10th, which is when the semester ends. Students will work remotely. The university is citing the demonstration and the continued occupation of 2 buildings for the closure. As part of the enforcement, police placed concrete barriers to prevent vehicles from entering certain parts of campus. Cal Poly Humboldt released a statement saying, in part, the investments in the university's endowment does not include any direct investment in defense companies or any securities issued by Israeli companies or organizations or to defense firms. Meanwhile, the University of Southern California has canceled its main commencement ceremony over what they call safety concerns brought on by the protests there. This graduating class, remember, it's the same class that had their high school graduations canceled back in 2020. CNN spoke with LA Mayor Karen Bass about this latest decision.
I believe that that was a decision that they had to make. They were expecting about 65,000 people on campus, and they just did not feel that it was going to be safe. And the job of the president, just like my job as mayor, my number one job is to make sure that Angelenos are safe. So the main graduation is canceled, but the individual schools have graduations as well. So there's a lot of ceremonies that will be taking place. But like you said, I share that also, the idea that they missed their graduation 4 years ago. But hopefully their individual schools will go forward peacefully.
Now, we spoke with Cal State East Bay communications professor Dr. Nolan Higdon about campus responses to these protests and other protests as the war continues.
I think college administrators are in a very difficult position. A lot of their rhetoric, on campus champions things like free speech, freedom of expression, diversity of viewpoints. But they're starting to see a big division between their students and even some of their faculty. And so administrators, I think, are wrestling with keeping their rhetoric and their actions consistent. If history is any indication, protests against war and conflict, they will continue to grow as long as the war goes on. And so if this war continues, I could see those bridge protests being, a very small demonstration as compared to what is to come. It seems like young people are refusing to budge on their position that they're opposed to what is being done in Gaza, just like many U.S. officials refuse to budge on their position. And so we're not seeing a lot of compromise or signs that things are going to change anytime soon.
Well, the protests across college campuses in the U.S. is also getting the attention from people displaced in Gaza. They even wrote messages with spray paint on their tents thanking the students for their demonstrations. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the weekend as the U.S. continues to push for a ceasefire and the release of hostages. The president dispatched Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the Middle East to work with partners on a potential ceasefire.
We're addressing it, working on it together with partners throughout the region. Hamas has before it a proposal that is extraordinarily generous on the part of Israel.
Hamas leaders flew to Egypt to discuss the latest proposal from Israel. It includes the group releasing as many as 33 hostages in exchange for a pause in hostilities in that region. And Hamas released more propaganda videos of hostages over the weekend. One of them included 64-year-old Keith Siegel. He was taken from his home on October 7th. Siegel's daughter is calling on Netanyahu to do more to strike a deal and get the hostages returned. Still ahead, we're going to continue our conversation about the campus war protests with a closer look at what demonstrators are calling for and a look back into history at what movements like this have been able to accomplish. This afternoon, we are diving into the growing protests at college campuses across the country right now. Demonstrators calling for a ceasefire and the release of hostages in Gaza. They're also calling for universities to divest from Israel and weapons manufacturers. Now, the problem for public universities is that's potentially illegal under a law signed by Governor Jerry Brown back in 2016. The bill prohibited discrimination in state contracts and specifically mentioned Israel. The law also says state agencies can't use free speech as a justification to discriminate in contracts. Joining me live now is political analyst Mark Sandalow. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Nice to be here.
All right, what do you make of the issue that in many of these protests, some of the protests that are at these universities, they're not actually students? What do you make of that?
That's been true of every protest I've ever covered. It's a problem, and because this is such a nuanced issue. To the extent you have students who, for their own tuition dollars, are paying for these grounds, and they simply want to camp there and let their views be known. How do you complain about that? On the other hand, to the extent that there are outsiders sometimes screaming anti-Semitic epithets at Jewish students, that's completely intolerable. And that's been the issue with this entire story, including the situation in the Middle East. It's so nuanced that it's very hard to say, the students are right, the students are wrong. Israel's right, Israel's wrong. You have to be able to grasp like shades of gray to be able to understand this. And of course, most people look at the world as black and white.
All right, well, you're also a professor, so let's go back in history a little bit and talk about the 1968 convention in Chicago and how this moment is very eerily familiar to that, in that how law enforcement reacted to protesters at that convention impacted the election.
Yeah, fortunately, it has not gotten that bloody yet, because there was blood on the streets of Chicago during the 68 convention. Hubert Humphrey was the nominee. And, Hubert Humphrey, you're looking at pictures here. The Democrats are returning to Chicago for their convention this time. But, Hubert Humphrey was the nominee. He was a civil rights icon, a favorite of liberals. But because he supported the war in Vietnam, his liberal reputation completely overshadowed. Never mind that Richard Nixon, his opponent, was more of a war supporter, more hawkish. These demonstrators you're watching here were protesting the Democrats, and that led a lot of people not to show up and vote for Humphrey, and he only lost by less than 1 percentage point.
All right, let's talk about what the protesters are demanding. They obviously want a ceasefire, but they also want the schools that they are attending to divest investments in what they say are supporting the Israeli military. Have you seen in the past how these protests can actually be successful in terms of getting what they want?
So maybe not directly, but indirectly. My time when I was in college, the big issue was divesting from South Africa. And eventually that worked. And if the divestment didn't work, because truthfully, colleges are rich, some of them with huge endowments, that doesn't mean that their money is going to change behavior necessarily. But look, this brings lots and lots of public attention. And like those protests you just saw in Chicago, that continual heartbeat from Americans' youth that we're not going to stand for getting drafted anymore led to even Richard Nixon pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam.
So how do you think university leadership at these different schools has handled the protests?
At times, it's hard. I mean, they're in a no-win situation. There's no question about that. But at times, it seems as if they've been heavy-handed. The problem is always in dispersing. I mean, the protesters themselves, for the most part, haven't been a problem. And it's easy for me to say this, sitting in my office here in Washington, D.C. But if you have a student screaming anti-Semitic insults at Jewish students, that is completely unacceptable. That person ought to be grabbed. That person ought to be thrown out. That person ought to not be on campus at all. But setting up tents, not necessarily much harm in that.
Well, you're a college professor. What are your students saying about the conflict in Gaza? Is this going to change the way that they vote come November?
If the White House were to hear what my students tell me in class, they would be terrified, because these are idealistic, 20, 21-year-olds, and they hate what's going on in Gaza. They see Biden as the bad guy. Never mind the fact, just like in 68 with Richard Nixon, Donald Trump is even more pro-Israel than Biden. That's not the issue for many of them. And it doesn't matter in California. Trump is going to win, and Trump is not going to win California. But look, if students at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor don't show up, Biden won't win Michigan. If they don't show up in the University of Wisconsin, he will lose those electoral votes. This certainly has the potential, even if it's not the number one issue after the economy and immigration, in a close election, absolutely this has the potential to cost Biden re-election.
Political analyst Mark Sandalow, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, it hasn't only been college campuses affected by anti-war protests. Coming up, we look at the impact of demonstrations on our bridges and roads and the consequences. Welcome back. All half hour, we've been talking about the anti-war protests happening at college campuses across the country and here in the Bay Area. These are the latest efforts from activists to bring attention to the plight of Palestinians. Remember, protesters shut down the Bay Bridge back in November? They were hoping to send a message to President Biden, who was in town for the APEC summit. 78 people were ordered to do community service and pay restitution to avoid jail time. And then just 2 weeks ago, protesters faced off against the highway patrol on the Golden Gate Bridge. Traffic was shut down on both spans of the bridge for hours. And that same day in the East Bay, pro-Palestinian protesters blocked northbound 880. Now, at the time, Governor Newsom condemned the protests.
I don't think that's helpful, and I don't think that's responsible. I think there are better ways of protesting. So, no, I hope we don't see it again. And I do think people need to be held to account for their actions.
And check this out. After shutting down freeways in the morning, protesters tore down a fence at Tesla's Fremont factory. They were rallying against what they called corporate support for actions against Gaza. Now, about a month earlier from that, demonstrators held a protest at the airport, taking over a section of SFO. They blocked the road in front of the international terminal and blocked a security checkpoint. We'll be right back. And thanks so much for joining us for today's conversation about the growing campus war protests. We know you have an opinion about this, and we'd love to hear what you think. Post your thoughts online using the hashtag KPIX. The CBS Evening News is next on KPIX. Local news continues on our streaming service, CBS News Bay Area. I'll see you at 5 o'clock.
Thanks for watching. You can always get all the latest headlines and weather over on Pix Plus. And remember to like and click the button on the bottom left of your screen to subscribe for the biggest Bay Area news.